Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 18 stories for you, including the geometry of the thread, the footprint mimic, the molt of the unseen tenant, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The geometry of the thread. Entry 1. The schoolhouse stands alone on a gravel road that seems to stretch toward a horizon that never quite arrives. It is a single room, dominated by a heavy oak table and a ceiling so high it feels like it might swallow the dust. I arrived here seeking silence, but the silence has a weight. Yesterday, my clothes were my own. Today, they are beginning to lie about who is wearing them. Entry 2. The wool sweater betrayed me first. It didn't just hang, it pulled. The left sleeve cinched toward my elbow with a sudden, hungry tension, as if something unseen was yanking the fabric from the inside out. When I touched the table, the cuff jerked a sharp, reflexive twitch. It felt like a phantom shoulder, heavy and cold, was trying to force its way into my own. Entry 3. The entity emerged from the corner. It is a cluster of floating glass shards held by a shimmering membrane. It doesn't move so much as vibrate, shifting from a sphere to a jagged prism. Then came the breath, a high-pitched, rhythmic screeching like an old dial-up modem, EEO-OGRSHHH, rippling through the air until my teeth hummed with the frequency. Entry 4. The sweater is sagging now, collapsing in places where there is nothing to hold it up, while tightening around a ribcage that feels wider than mine. I sat on the floor and watched the entity pulse forward. Its shards clicked like wind chimes in a gale. It didn't walk. It surged, hungry for space. Entry 5. The dial-up shriek is constant now, searching for a frequency. E-O-O-whir, it sang, and my trousers buckled at the knee with a violent snap. A sharp, triangular point poked outward from my thigh, a protrusion of bone or glass that shouldn't exist. I am still sitting here, but my pants are reacting to a phantom limb. Entry 6. It is negotiating. The entity isn't just inhabiting the room, it is merging with my geometry. Every time it shrieks, SHHHE pop, a new fold appears in my shirt. My tunic now has a bulge near my collarbone that throbs when I breathe. It is searching for a port, hunting for the best place to plug into my anatomy. Entry 7. The sensation is becoming visceral. When I stand, there is a sickening drag on my left hip, as if a second set of hips is trying to squeeze through the same skin. The entity has grown, its shards spanning half the room, humming with digital urgency. E-O-O click, it trilled, and my sleeves elongated by 3 inches in a sudden, agonizing stretch. Entry 8. My silhouette is dissolving. My clothes are no longer garments, they're a map of an incoming guest. My coat is being pulled toward my spine, creating a long, tapering tail of fabric that drags on the gravel floor like a shadow. The entity's membrane glows amber, vibrating so intensely that the dust on the table dances in frantic, geometric patterns. GRSHHHEE, it whispered through the noise. Entry 9. The transformation reached its zenith an hour ago with a violent tug at my center of gravity. My shirt smoothed out over a wide, flat expanse of skin that hadn't been there before. The entity has arrived inside the garment. It is no longer a separate object. It is a shape inhabiting my threads. I am still me, but my clothes are perfectly tailored to a body that is slightly larger, sharper, and infinitely more complex than the one I walked in with. Entry 10. I reached out to touch the entity's glass heart, and for a moment, our textures overlapped, a cold, sharp friction against my skin. The dial-up shriek gave one final, triumphant ding. My clothes settled into a perfect fit, every wrinkle smoothed away, every seam aligned with mathematical precision. I am standing in the center of the schoolhouse, wearing a suit that fits me perfectly. However, when I look down at my hands, they are still human, but the fabric over my knuckles is beginning to pulse with a heartbeat that isn't mine. Entry 11. The schoolhouse stands alone on a gravel road that seems to stretch toward a horizon that never quite arrives. The footprint mimic. I swear to you, by the time the fire dies down and our voices stop echoing against these trees, you'll understand why I don't like walking through old buildings alone. It happened 3 years ago at the Grandview Mall. a sprawling concrete labyrinth that had been abandoned for nearly a decade. The lights were mostly off, but the atmosphere wasn't empty. It felt heavy, as if the air itself was saturated with the ghosts of shoppers past. I had stayed behind after the final gate rolled down an hour prior, seeking a moment of solitude in the cavernous silence. The mall was a graveyard of storefronts and mannequins, illuminated only by the moon filtering through the vaulted glass ceiling. It was then that I found it, a small, humming white noise machine sitting perfectly centered on the floor of the food court. It wasn't there yesterday. It was a boxy, brass-colored device with a flickering amber light on top, emitting a steady, rhythmic hiss like distant rainfall. I sat down on a nearby bench and felt my eyelids grow heavy. As sleep began to pull at me, the white noise started to shift. It stopped being a blur of sound and began to coalesce into distinct, muffled words. "You are heavy," the machine whispered in a voice that sounded like grinding stones. I startled awake, looking around the vast space. The mall was silent again. Then, as I drifted back towards sleep, the hiss returned, forming new syllables. "The carpet remembers." I looked down at my feet. My sneakers were pressing into the thick, industrial carpet, leaving deep indentations in the pile. I realized then that the white noise machine wasn't just generating sound, it was translating the physical weight of my movement into speech. I stood up and took a few steps toward the fountain. Each time my heel struck the ground, the machine hummed a new word. Left, right, sink, pull. It was describing my gait in real time. But as the minutes passed, the sound changed from description to observation. The voice became sharper, more deliberate. "The dent is deep," it murmured. I stopped moving, but the machine kept talking, "But the other one is deeper." I looked back at the spot where I had first sat down. A new set of dents had appeared in the carpet, not my own. They were perfectly shaped indentations, arranged in a sequence that matched my walk, but they were slightly larger and more jagged than my footprints. It was as if something had walked over my path, mirroring my movements exactly from a few seconds before I made them. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine. I started to walk faster toward the main entrance, my footsteps becoming hurried. The machine began to pace itself with me, fast, urgent, trembling. Then it whispered something that made my breath hitch. Almost there. I felt a sudden pressure behind my shoulder, though I saw nothing. The white noise grew louder, vibrating the floorboards. Every time I took a step, a new set of dents appeared just a few feet ahead of me, as if an invisible traveler were walking in my shadow, catching up to me and pressing into the fibers with its own weight. I could hear it now, a soft, wet suction sound, like a boot pulling out of mud. It wasn't just mimicking my walk, it was perfecting it. The entity didn't have a face or a body in the traditional sense. It was a collection of textures and pressures. When I finally reached the center of the atrium, I froze. The white noise machine sat perfectly still, but the voice grew frantic. "Wait. Watch. Follow." From the shadows of the balcony above, something descended. It didn't have limbs or a head. It looked like a floating mass of overlapping textures, velvet, rough burlap, and smooth leather all fused into a shifting, undulating shape. It moved by pressing itself into the carpet, creating deep, permanent creases as it rolled forward. It had no eyes to see me, yet it knew exactly where I was because it felt the dents my body left in the world. It moved toward me with a heavy, rhythmic thrumming, its surface rippling like water. It reached the spot directly in front of my face and stopped. The white noise machine gave one final, clear burst of sound. "Your turn." The entity pressed itself against my chest, and for a second, I felt the carpet's texture against my skin. Then it pulled back, leaving a perfectly deep dent in the air right where my heart was beating. The Molt of the Unseen Tenant. I didn't think much of the crawl space until the first night we moved into the Victorian. It was a cramped, dusty vein running beneath the floorboards, smelling of damp earth and ancient wood. I spent 3 hours down there on Tuesday, clearing away cobwebs and old insulation, feeling like an explorer in a subterranean cavern. But on Wednesday, as I sat in the kitchen with my coffee, I noticed something peculiar about the silence. It wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a weighted pressure. That was when I heard the first click, a sharp, wet snap coming from beneath my feet. It sounded like a heavy shell cracking open and hitting the dirt. Then came the hum, a low-frequency vibration that made the spoons in the drawer rattle. The house felt occupied, but not by people. I went back down into the crawl space with a lantern, expecting to find a mouse or perhaps a stray branch. Instead, I found the first molt. It was slumped against the foundation wall, a perfect hollow shell of something organic. It had a segmented body covered in overlapping plates that looked like iridescent beetle wings, but it was translucent and papery. It lacked a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it had 3 vertical slits along its crown that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light. It wasn't just a dead thing, it was a discarded skin. I realized then that something had been moving through my house, shedding layers of itself as it traveled. The next night, I woke up to the sound of scraping. Each room felt different. In the hallway, there was a molt with jagged, crystalline spines protruding from its back like a frozen crown. In the living room, there sat another one, this time smooth and bulbous, resembling a giant seed pod with tiny, vestigial limbs. Every morning I woke up to find more of these husks. They were perfectly preserved, yet they felt heavy, as if they still held the memory of movement. The entity was moving faster now, its molts appearing in pairs, then trios. By Friday, the house was a graveyard of discarded selves. I began to notice that the entity wasn't just shedding, it was refining itself. The first molts were clumsy and rough, but each subsequent one became more elegant, more deliberate. However, there was a problem with its pace. It was molting too much. Each time it moved from the kitchen to the bedroom, it left behind 2 bodies instead of 1. One was the shell it had just stepped out of, the other was a lingering shadow of where it had been moments before. By Saturday night, I stayed awake in the master bedroom, my breath held tight in my chest. The humming grew into a constant, grinding roar. The air felt thick, as if we were submerged in water. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. A profound silence fell, more absolute than any I had ever experienced. It was a gap in the night where no stars will ever grow, a vacuum of sound so deep it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Then came the final movement. The entity emerged from the closet, fully formed for the first time since we moved in. It didn't have the jagged spines or the crystalline crowns anymore. It had a body made of shimmering, velvet-textured scales that shifted color from deep violet to bruised gold. It had 4 joints in its limbs and a head crowned with weeping, willow-like filaments that swayed even though there was no wind. It moved with a fluid, liquid grace, gliding over the floorboards without making a single sound. It stopped in front of my bed and stood perfectly still. Its filament crown brushed against my forehead, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of recognition, as if it were looking at me not as an intruder, but as a masterpiece. It pulsed once, its scales turning a brilliant, luminous white, and then it let out one final, crystalline chime. The entity settled into the center of the room, sinking slightly into the rug like it was becoming part of the house itself. I closed my eyes to sleep, but when I opened them at dawn, the entity was gone. There were no shells left behind in the bedroom, no hums and no vibrations. Only a single molt remained in the center of the floor, a perfect, hollow replica of the entity's final form, standing tall and waiting. But as I reached out to touch it, I realized it wasn't empty. Inside the hollow shell, something was still pressing against the interior walls from the inside. The Ledger of the 40-Step Man. I found the ledger buried in a silt bed at the base of the Great Glacial Rift, nestled within an ice cave that had begun to weep. It was a heavy, leather-bound volume, its pages stiff with moisture from the sudden thaw. The title on the first page read, The Repository of Lost and Found. It wasn't a record of things lost by people, but rather items surrendered to the cave itself. As I sat in the hollow of the cave, listening to the rhythmic drip-drop of melting frost, I began to read the entries. They were strange. Most days, the ledger recorded simple things, a copper button, a smooth river stone, a frayed ribbon. But every third page featured an item that had been returned multiple times, each time with a new note from the cave's keeper. A silver thimble, it read, returned by the man in the crowd. The next entry, a silver thimble, returned by the man in the crowd. It continued for dozens of pages, the item remaining constant while the circumstances changed. I looked up from the book and noticed him for the first time. He was standing at the edge of the cave's entrance, a silhouette against the pale blue light of the exterior. He wasn't a ghost or a spirit. He was a man in a heavy wool coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. But what struck me most was his distance. He stood exactly 40 steps away from me. No matter how I moved, whether I crouched to turn a page or stood up to stretch my aching back, he maintained that precise, mathematical gap. When I took 2 steps forward, he retreated 2. It was a deliberate, rhythmic synchronization. The drip of the ice became a metronome for his steady presence. As the thaw accelerated, the walls of the cave began to moan, and the water level rose slightly around my boots. I found myself reading further, deeper into the ledger's heart. That was when I saw the names of the items start to change from objects to fragments of self. A sense of direction, it read, returned by the man in the crowd. Then, the memory of a first kiss. Each time, the man remained 40 steps away, his posture unmoving, as if he were a statue caught in mid-motion. I began to feel a prickle of unease. Why was he returning these things? And why did he never approach me? The cave grew colder despite the melting ice, a biting chill that seemed to emanate from him rather than the walls. Then, the ledger revealed the truth of his identity in the final few pages. He wasn't just a man, he was a keeper of replicas. I realized the items weren't truly lost, they were traded. The cave took a piece of your soul and gave you something else in return. But as I read the very last entry, my heart hammered against my ribs. It didn't list an object or a memory. It simply said, the woman who loved him. I looked toward the man, 40 steps away, and finally saw his face clearly. He was a perfect duplicate of my late wife, Clara. She had her same rounded chin, her nose with that tiny bump on the tip, and her hair was swept back in a way that felt familiar enough to make my breath hitch. However, there was a glitch in her physical form. Her hair was parted deeply on the left side, but as I watched, it flicked violently to the right. It happened with a wet, sliding sound, like silk being pulled through water. She didn't blink, she just stood there, 40 steps away. Then, the ledger had one final, tiny footnote at the very bottom of the page. She remembers his face, but forgets which side her hair is parted on. I watched as her hair slid back to the left, then immediately snapped to the right again. The man-woman reached out a hand toward me, stopping just before it could bridge the gap. He stayed at 40 steps, yet he felt as though he were reaching into my very chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of her voice, I heard the sound of ice cracking in a deep cavern. He didn't say, hello. Instead, he whispered a single word that seemed to vibrate through the cave walls, wait. As the words faded, the water surged upward, touching my ankles, and she took one step forward. For the first time since I had entered the cave, the gap between us was 39 steps. The ledger lay open in my lap, the ink of the final line beginning to bleed into the damp paper as the next entry started to write itself. The man who found the ledger. Just then, the heavy wool coat shifted, and she took another step forward, 38. The resonance of the iron cradle. To whoever takes my shift, do not trust the rhythm. When I first arrived at Platform 9, it was a masterpiece of engineering, a forest of steel wading into the churning gray of the North Sea. But during the gale, when the wind screams through the lattice girders like a flute played by a giant, the platform doesn't just move, it breathes. It heaves and sighs under the weight of the waves, making every loose bolt hum with a low-frequency vibration that settles into your marrow. I was the solo technician for the 3rd week, tasked with monitoring the turbines and maintaining the interior cabin. It was on the 14th night that I first noticed the rocking chair in the mess hall. It was an antique thing, heavy oak with a curved back, sitting alone in the center of the room like a throne for a ghost. On my 2nd night, as the storm reached its peak, I walked into the mess hall to pour a cup of coffee and saw it swaying. There was no draft, only a steady, rhythmic motion back and forth, side to side. I sat down, took a sip, and then retreated to the galley to check the pressure gauges. When I returned 5 minutes later, The chair was still moving, but with more vigor, as if someone had just pressed their weight into the seat. That was when I first heard it. The hum. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through a crack in the hull, but the pitch was perfect. It wasn't a melody, it was a drone that matched my own pulse. Every time my heart thudded against my ribs, the hum resonated in the air around me, vibrating the water in my mug into tiny, concentric ripples. By the third night, the chair began to move even when I wasn't looking. It didn't just rock, it accelerated. The wood would creak a sharp, dry snap every time it reached the apex of its swing. And then, the entity appeared. It wasn't a solid shape at first, but a distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. It was a mass of textured velvet and iridescent scales, shimmering with colors that shouldn't exist in a steel cabin. It had no face, only a series of vibrating membranes across its top that rippled like the surface of a pond. It didn't walk. It drifted toward the chair, pulling itself along using 6 limbs that looked like braided silk threads. Most importantly, it was learning my heart. The hum became more complex. If my pulse quickened because I was startled, the entity would let out a frantic, shimmering trill. If I grew tired and my heart slowed to a steady thrum, the entity would settle into a deep, resonant groan that made the floorboards vibrate under my boots. It followed me everywhere. I would be checking the turbine blades in the outer deck, and I'd feel it hovering just behind my shoulder, its velvet body absorbing the salt spray. It was patient. It didn't hunt by pouncing, it hunted by sinking. Every time we shared a room, our heartbeats fell into perfect unison. The hum became so loud that I could feel it in my teeth, a constant, vibrating presence that bridged the gap between my chest and its shimmering body. On the final night of my shift, the gale died down to a whisper. I stood in the mess hall, exhausted, watching the chair move in a slow, majestic arc. The entity was perched on the seat, its braided limbs wrapped around the wood like a nest of vines. It wasn't just matching my heart anymore, it was commanding it. As I watched, my pulse began to race without any physical exertion, forced into a frantic gallop by the entity's demands. My chest heaved as the hum rose to a piercing, melodic shriek that echoed off the metal walls. I felt my ribs expand and contract in time with its shimmering membranes. It reached out a single silk limb and touched my sternum, sending a jolt of electricity through my skin. Then it stopped. The motion ceased instantly. The chair froze at a slight tilt. The hum vanished into total silence. In that vacuum of sound, I realized the entity wasn't just mimicking me, it was perfecting me, carving its own rhythm into my very anatomy. It pulled itself off the chair and hovered inches from my face, its membranes glowing with a soft, amber light. It waited for 1 second, then let out a final, tiny pulse of sound, a perfect replica of my own heartbeat, played back to me as if it were an echo. I realized then that it didn't need me to be the source anymore. It had stolen the beat and kept the rhythm for itself. I am leaving this platform tomorrow, but the chair will remain. It still rocks, even when the air is still, because something else is sitting in it, waiting for the next heart to arrive so it can start the music again. The corridor of the unfinished mile. I never intended to stay on the 412 Express, but when the engine groaned and died deep within the subterranean belly of the Great North Tunnel, I had no choice. The lights flickered once, twice, and then vanished, leaving us in a velvet darkness broken only by the rhythmic, dying hum of the train's cooling metal. It was a communal silence, at first, the kind that settles when 50 people realize they are suspended in a tube of stone. Then came the weather. I leaned my forehead against the glass of the passenger window to see what lay ahead. Expecting the damp masonry of the tunnel, I instead saw a violent, swirling blizzard. Snowflakes the size of dinner plates whipped past the pane, dancing in a gale that shouldn't exist underground. Beside me, a woman gasped. "It's snowing," she whispered, her voice trembling. But when she looked at the ceiling, she saw only solid rock. The train was motionless, yet my window showed a world of white fury. As the minutes ticked by, the blizzard outside began to change. It shifted from snow to a torrential, golden rain that fell upward, defying gravity. Then, it became a dense, emerald fog where colossal, Prehistoric ferns swayed in an invisible breeze. The scenery was inconsistent. It didn't flow like a landscape, but blinked like a malfunctioning film reel. Every time I blinked, the weather outside transformed into something impossible. A desert of violet sand, a sea of floating bubbles, and a forest of crystal pillars. Then, the doors hissed open. The air that rushed in wasn't tunnel dust. It smelled of ozone and old parchment. A corridor stretched out from the train car into the void. It looked like a hallway made of polished mahogany and brass, stretching away into the darkness. I stepped out onto the carpeted floor. "Is this the way out?" a man asked, his voice echoing strangely. We walked forward. The corridor was manageable, maybe 30 feet long, lined with velvet curtains that felt like heavy silk under my hand. At the end of it sat a door. We pushed it open, expecting to step back into the tunnel, or perhaps into the blizzard. Instead, we stepped out into a vast, silent ballroom where the floor was made of cracked porcelain. "How did it get so big?" someone shouted. I looked back at the corridor we had just traversed. It was still there, but it felt different. When we had walked into it from the train, it was a short, cozy path. Now, looking back, it stretched out like a marathon of wood and brass. The mahogany walls seemed to have multiplied. Where there were 3 pillars before, there were now dozens, receding into the distance like a fleet of masts on an ocean. I took a step back into the corridor, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I walked toward the train again, the hallway didn't shrink. It stayed exactly as long as it had been when we exited, a sprawling, cavernous expanse. The more we moved away from the train, the further the door became. It was a spatial paradox. The corridor grew with our distance from its origin. I realized then that the hallway wasn't just a path, it was a living measurement of our departure. Every time we tried to return to the train car, we had to cross those same 30 feet, but now they felt like 3 miles of mahogany and velvet. The farther we moved into the ballroom, the longer the corridor became on the way back. I looked at the woman who had sat next to me earlier. She was standing near a porcelain vase, looking back at us with wide eyes. "The train is getting further away," she said. She was right. The door, the gateway back to our carriage, was shrinking in size and growing in distance. I tried to run for it, but the corridor stretched like taffy. For every step I took toward the train, the hallway seemed to generate more mahogany planks, more velvet curtains, and more brass fixtures. It was as if the hall was trying to keep us away from our starting point, feeding on our momentum. I finally sprinted, my boots thudding against the carpet. The walls blurred into a brown smear. I could see the train door now, a rectangle of light in the distance. I pushed through the threshold and collapsed onto the seat, the scent of ozone fading into the smell of old leather. I sat there for a long time, breathing hard. I looked at my hand, then at the woman across from me. She was staring at her own palm. "We made it back," she said, though her voice sounded thin. I nodded, but as I looked out the window again, the blizzard had vanished. It was perfectly still now. But when I looked toward the door we had just exited, I saw that the corridor hadn't stayed behind in the ballroom. A tiny piece of it, just a single mahogany plank with a brass handle, was hovering in the air of our train car, slowly stretching toward the ceiling as if it were still trying to reach the door. The laundry room lullaby. I stood in the basement of the Grandview Hotel, a place where the air always tasted of steam and old cotton. It was 2 a.m., that hollow hour when the building seems to hold its breath. Most guests were asleep upstairs, but I remained below, tasked with folding the endless mountain of linen. The laundry room was a cavernous space filled with the rhythmic thrum of heavy industrial washers and the sharp, metallic scent of starch. In the far corner, separated from the humming machines by a heavy velvet curtain, sat an isolated cot. It was a simple wooden frame with a mattress that looked as though it had been smoothed by years of invisible weight. No guest ever slept there, no traveler checked it into their room. Yet, every night, I watched a shape move toward it. It began as a mere smudge of shadow, but as I turned my head, it solidified into a presence. It was the mother, or at least, that is what the hotel staff called her. She didn't walk so much as glide across the concrete floor. She had no face in the traditional sense. Instead, her head was a smooth, rounded orb of ochre-colored stone, textured like a weathered peach. When she moved toward the cot, her body was fluid and undulating, but the moment I looked directly at her, she would fracture into a cluster of geometric blocks. These cubes, some large and heavy, others tiny as grains of sand, would hover in the air around her core, held together by an invisible magnetic pull. The second I blinked or shifted my gaze to the baskets of towels, those blocks would snap back into a seamless, flowing silhouette. She reached the cot and began her nightly ritual. She leaned over the empty mattress with a grace that felt heavy. Her hands, which resembled polished river stones rather than flesh, gripped the edge of the quilt. Then she began to tuck. She pulled the fabric tight under the corners, smoothing out every wrinkle with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. It was as if she were preparing for a child who never arrived. I found myself mesmerized by her movements. She didn't just fold, she cradled. As I watched, she began to hum a low, vibrating note that resonated in my chest cavity more than my ears. And then, the corrections started. A voice, raspy and layered like a record played at 2 different speeds, drifted from her stone head. "He fell into the well," she whispered, her body momentarily crumbling into sharp, jagged pyramids. Then, as she smoothed the pillow, she corrected herself with a slight shudder of her blocks. "No, he tripped over the root." She paused, tucking a corner of the sheet so firmly it nearly pleated. Actually, he was swept away by the tide. The corrections weren't just words, they were physical shifts in her form. When she said well, her blocks became deep and cavernous. When she said root, they sharpened into points. By the time she reached tide, she seemed to ripple like water. She was mourning someone, or perhaps something, trying to find the perfect way to describe a single moment of ending. I took a step forward, my sneakers squeaking on the damp floor. The mother froze. Her blocks instantly shattered into a chaotic cloud of cubes before knitting back together into her fluid shape. She looked at me, or rather, she oriented her stone head toward me. "He was afraid," she murmured. Then, immediately, he was brave. Then, with a finality that made the laundry machine seem to go silent, he didn't know he was about to be. She reached out a hand, a smooth, rounded stone of a limb, and touched my shoulder. It wasn't hot or cold. It felt like touching a piece of marble that had been sitting in the sun for an hour. I felt a strange pressure in my mind, a sudden flash of a boy with messy hair and a missing shoe, running toward something unseen. She turned back to the cot. She took the final corner of the blanket and tucked it inward with such force that the wood of the frame creaked. She leaned down until her peach-textured head was inches from the empty pillow. The blocks of her body settled into a steady, humming rhythm. "He is sleeping now," she said. Then, she corrected herself one last time, her voice barely a breath. "He is finally still." She didn't move again. She stayed there, a sculpture of stone and motion, hovering over the empty bed as if waiting for the occupant to wake up and notice that the mother had finally finished telling his story. I realized then that she wasn't just tucking in an empty bed. She was holding the space open for a ghost who hadn't quite decided how he died yet. I stayed there until the sun began to bleed through the high, grime-streaked windows of the basement. When I finally left, the cot was perfectly made. Not a single wrinkle remained. But as I walked toward the stairs, I felt her gaze on my back. The mother hadn't moved, but she had changed again. Her blocks were no longer geometric. They were now slightly rounded, as if they were beginning to soften into something softer than stone, preparing for the next correction. The tapping of the iron hull. The engine died at 3 o'clock, and with it, the rhythmic thrum of the world ceased. The transition from mechanical life to oceanic silence was jarring. For hours, the steady heartbeat of the pistons had been my only companion, muffling the vastness of the sea. Now there is only the groan of the hull, a long, metallic sigh as the ship settles into the deep and the endless, undulating heave of the midnight tide. I am alone on the Mariner's Rest, a trawler that feels far too large for a single soul to occupy. The cabin air has grown stagnant, smelling of salt and old copper, while outside, the spray tastes of brine and ancient secrets. In the center of the main deck sits the security camera, a bulky, industrial eye mounted on a swivel. It was designed to monitor the nets for tangled fish or drifting debris, but tonight, in the absence of movement, it seems to be watching me with a predatory intent. I sat on a crate of twine, shivering as the temperature dropped, my breath forming tiny ghosts of mist in the moonlight. The silence was heavy, thick enough to feel like a weight against my eardrums. The first sound wasn't the water, it was a sharp, percussive click against the bulkhead. Clack, it sounded like a wooden mallet hitting a taut string. I froze, my fingers gripping the rough twine of the crate. Then came another, slightly further away, echoing off the curved ceiling. Clack, clack. I looked toward the shadow of the galley door, my eyes straining against the gloom. There was nothing there but the swaying gear and a few stray ropes dancing in the breeze. Yet, when I turned my head back to the camera, it had rotated 3 degrees to the left, its mechanical pivot whirring softly as it focused on the exact spot where the sound had originated. A prickle of heat rose on my neck, the sensation of being observed by something unseen. "Who's there?" I whispered to the empty air. My voice felt small, swallowed instantly by the expanse of the ocean. The answer didn't come in words, but in a rapid sequence of taps that echoed through the ribcage of the ship like a pulse. Clack, clack, clack. It was rhythmic, almost musical, possessed of a deliberate cadence that suggested intelligence rather than chance. Then, the first note emerged, a clear, resonant tone that vibrated against my teeth. It wasn't just noise, it was the physical sensation of wood hitting felt, a deep and sonorous thrum. The entity moved into the light of the swaying lantern, emerging from the periphery of the shadows. It was a cluster of loose piano hammers, suspended by thick, wiry tendons of braided silk. They didn't have a body exactly, they were a swarm of ivory and mahogany pegs, floating in a semicircle like a constellation of falling teeth. They danced in the air, bobbing on invisible currents as if swimming through water. Every few seconds, they would strike the metal hull in unison, creating a shimmering resonance that hummed in my chest. Each time they struck, they produced the perfect note for my name, LIS. It wasn't a voice, it was the physical impact of 3 hammers hitting the steel at different intervals to mimic the syllables. I stood up, my chair scraping against the deck with a harsh, jarring screech. The camera swung toward me with a mechanical whir, its lens widening as if to catch my expression in high definition. The hammer swarm drifted closer, circling my head like hummingbirds. They moved with a frantic, fluttering grace, their silk tendons stretching and snapping against one another with the sound of tiny whips. They began to tap faster, the notes of LIS becoming a frantic staccato that seemed to build in intensity. I reached out a hand, my fingers trembling, expecting to feel something solid, a handle, a face, a limb. But the hammers hovered just an inch from my skin, vibrating with anticipation like 1,000 tiny hearts beating against my palm. "Are you hungry?" I asked, my voice trembling in the vastness of the ocean. The response was a deafening crash of every hammer hitting at once, a discordant chord that shook the very floorboards beneath my boots and sent a vibration up my spine. Then, they settled into a steady, haunting melody, tapping out my name over and over as they began to move toward the camera. One by one, the hammers drifted into the frame of the lens, filling the view until all I could see was the pale, ivory surface of the largest hammer. It hovered right in front of the glass, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then it struck once more, loud and final. The sound didn't just echo in my ears. It felt as though it had physically pushed me back into the seat, a concussive wave of sound that momentarily stole my breath. The camera lurched one last time, turning away from the hammers to face the spot where I stood. It stayed there for a long minute, perfectly still, as if acknowledging my presence. Then the tapping stopped entirely. In the sudden silence, the heaviest hammer drifted toward my ear and struck the side of my head with a soft, muffled thud. It wasn't just marking my name anymore, it was mimicking the sound of a closing door. The root of the recurrence. I started as a traveler, but I ended as a prisoner of the geometry. The logging road began as a straight line of pine and cedar, a pragmatic artery cut into the wilderness for hauling timber. But as I drove deeper, the map in my lap became useless. The odometer kept spinning, yet the scenery refused to change. It was as if the forest were stretching its limbs just ahead of my headlights, creating more distance than the paper promised. By the third hour, the trees grew so dense that they seemed to lean inward, forming a cathedral of needles. Then I saw them, the roots. They weren't buried underground like normal roots. They broke through the dirt in thick, braided ropes of wood, arching over the road like frozen waves. They were moving, not with the fluid grace of a river, but with a rhythmic, tectonic pulse. Every year, these roots grew toward the center of the forest, and tonight, I realized they were growing toward me. I pulled my car to a halt when the ground beneath my tires groaned like a ship's hull. The air felt heavy, saturated with the scent of damp earth and old sap. I stepped out into the silence, and that was when I heard her. She didn't walk. She moved in the frozen stutter of a call with no signal. One moment, she was 30 paces away, a silhouette against a towering hemlock. The next, she would jump forward 3 feet, then pause, as if waiting for a voice to travel through the thick air before resuming her leap. She was not a ghost of smooth motion, but a woman of interrupted frames. She had skin the color of wet clay and hair that didn't fall, but rather clumped together in heavy, dripping coils like seaweed. Her face was dominated by an oversized, square jaw and ears that were notched with tiny, jagged ridges. Instead of eyes, she had 2 deep, horizontal slits across her brow that leaked a faint, amber nectar whenever she moved. She looked less like a person and more like a sculpture someone had started to carve and then abandoned halfway through. I stood paralyzed as she stuttered toward me. Each jump left a faint ripple in the air, a shimmering distortion like heat haze on a summer road. I felt the roots beneath my boots tighten their grip on the earth. They were reaching for my ankles now, curling upward to cradle my heels. "Please, let the forest be still," I whispered, my voice cracking in the heavy quiet. It was a prayer at first, a simple plea to the trees and the dirt to stop their hungry reaching. But as she drew closer, her jagged ears twitching with every stuttered leap, the words began to shift. The request became an admission. "Please, let the forest be still," I said again, but it felt heavier this time. I am the one who disturbed the silence. She stopped just a foot from my face, her amber nectar dripping onto my collar. She didn't have a mouth in the traditional sense. Rather, she had a wide, horizontal seam that ran across her cheeks. When she finally moved, it wasn't a leap but a slow, grinding slide of her jaw upward. I am the one who took the path, I confessed, my voice trembling as the roots wrapped around my calves, pulling me toward the dirt. And I am the one who forgot to say thank you. The forest didn't just have roots, it had a memory. The woman wasn't an inhabitant of the woods so much as she was the physical manifestation of every step ever taken on this road, every fallen branch, and every drop of rain that had ever hit a needle. She was the sum of the logging road's history. As I knelt in the mud, my knees sinking into the loam, the roots began to pull me down with deliberate intent. They weren't just holding me, they were weaving around my ribs, anchoring my torso to the ground. The woman leaned over me, her square jaw hanging open, and for a second, the stuttering stopped completely. She became perfectly still, a masterpiece of paused motion. I felt the warmth of her clay-colored skin against my forehead. I realized then that she wasn't watching me. She was waiting for me to finish being part of the road. The roots tightened, until my breath hitched, pulling my spine into a perfect arch. They were knitting themselves into my bones, turning my skeleton into timber and my veins into sap. I looked up at her one last time before the ground claimed my chin. She didn't blink, she couldn't, but she leaned in until her horizontal seam was inches from my lips. The prayer had finished its transformation into a final, humble surrender of the self. I wasn't a traveler anymore. I was the next growth point. I felt my feet merge with the dirt, my fingers turning into woody shoots that reached for the sky. The forest inhaled deeply, and as my vision blurred into a haze of green and brown, I realized why the map ended here. The road doesn't just go on forever, it waits to be fed. I am part of the wood now, and tonight, I can feel my toes twitching beneath the soil, preparing to push through the surface for the next traveler who dares to drive into the silence. The agreement of the tattered page. The sea did not roar. It hummed, a low vibration that traveled through the soles of my boots and into the marrow of my bones. I stood on a ledge so narrow it felt like an afterthought of the cliffside, a mere ribbon of limestone jutting out over the churning Atlantic. The fog arrived not as a mist, but as a heavy, damp velvet curtain, erasing the horizon until there was only the immediate present, the salt spray, the crumbling stone beneath me, and the rhythmic thrumming in my ribcage. It started as a faint pulse, secondary to my own breathing. At first, I thought it was the tide hitting the base of the cliff, but as the fog thickened, the sound localized. It was inside my chest. Thump-thump, thump-thump. It wasn't my heart. Mine was steady and singular. This new beat was heavy, resonant, and perfectly synchronized with the flickering movement of the mist. I looked down at my hands and noticed they were beginning to turn slightly translucent at the tips, as if the ink of a pen were bleeding into my skin from the inside out. That was when I saw it emerging from the center of the fog bank, a shape that defied solid geometry. It did not walk so much as unfold. It was a towering creature made entirely of wet newspaper, its body a chaotic assembly of headlines and columns of text. The paper was sodden, clinging to itself in heavy pleats, and every time it moved, it produced the soft, wet sound of a page being turned. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it had dozens of faces printed on its front surface, each one a different expression captured in ink. A weeping woman here, a shouting man there, and a row of tiny, screaming mouths along its collarbone. These faces weren't static, they shifted like a film strip. The weeping woman's tears were actual droplets of black ink that rolled down the paper skin. The shouting man's jaw moved in a silent, constant motion. As it drifted closer, the heartbeat in my chest grew louder, more insistent. It began to dictate the rhythm of its movement. With every heavy beat, the creature would fold inward, collapsing into a dense cube before unfolding again with a crisp, structural snap. I felt the weight of its presence pressing against my lungs. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice sounding thin against the vastness of the sea. The creature paused. Its largest face, a serene, wide-eyed girl whose hair was a series of elegant cursive loops, opened its ink-stained mouth. It didn't speak with vocal cords, but rather by vibrating the paper across its frame. "I am the preface," it resonated. The sound felt like 1,000 tiny voices humming at once. It reached out with an arm that looked like a rolled-up scroll of newsprint. Where my hand met its touch, I didn't feel skin. I felt the texture of grain and the slight dampness of a morning edition. As it touched my shoulder, the heartbeat in my chest surged, becoming a frantic staccato. The faces on the creature began to change rapidly, spinning through expressions of joy, terror, and profound boredom. "You have entered the margin," the preface said, its paper body rippling like a wave. I realized then that I wasn't just observing it, I was being absorbed by it. The edges of my own silhouette were beginning to fray into jagged lines of text. The fog seemed to be composed of tiny, microscopic letters, swirling in the air like dust motes. Every time the heartbeat struck, a new paragraph appeared on my skin, a description of my fear, my history, and the way the salt tasted on my tongue. The creature leaned in, its front page pressing against my forehead. The faces began to move faster, becoming a blur of ink and motion. I could feel the heartbeat now dominating my own pulse, eventually overriding it until my original heart fell silent. There was only the rhythmic, authoritative thrum of the newspaper's internal clock. "Read me," the creature commanded. I tried to speak, but my words came out as a series of punctuation marks. The ledge beneath me felt less like stone and more like a footnote at the bottom of a vast, unfolding page. The sea was the margin, the fog was the white space. I reached out to grab a fold of its body, but my fingers were now perfectly flat, textured with fine print. As the creature fully unfolded, it wrapped itself around me, pulling me into its soggy, fragrant embrace. The headlines on its back began to rearrange themselves, forming new words that hadn't existed a moment ago. They described the sensation of being read, the weight of being observed, and the inevitable conclusion of the line. I felt myself thinning out, stretching across the paper expanse. I was no longer a person standing on a cliff. I was a sentence in progress. The heartbeat gave one final, tectonic thud that shook the very foundations of my being. The creature pulled back slightly, its many faces settling into a look of quiet satisfaction. It folded itself once more, tug as it did, leaving me suspended in the damp air. I looked down at my own chest where the heart had been and saw that the pulse had left behind a permanent mark, a single, bold word written in perfect calligraphy. Continue, the preface whispered as the last of the fog settled into the creases of our shared story. I realized then that I was no longer the reader. I was the ink. The Descent of the Vault. Logbook 1, Day 1. The water is a sheet of hammered silver tonight. I have anchored the cabin at the furthest reach of the lake, where the ripples die out into silence. There are no lights on the shore to distract the eye, just the timber walls of my shelter and the immense, heavy weight of the sky. It feels solid, like a vault lid held high above me by an invisible hand. I am alone, save for the rhythmic lap of water against the hull. Logbook 2, Day 3. The silence is beginning to feel intentional. Every time I close my eyes, I get the sensation that the ceiling of the sky isn't infinite, but a physical surface. It feels as though it is moving inward, toward the lake, at a pace so glacial that I can barely perceive the movement until I stop to think about it. Logbook 1, Day 7. A strange acoustic anomaly has begun. Today, while I was boiling water for tea, I heard the distinct clink of a spoon hitting porcelain. But I hadn't moved yet. The sound occurred exactly 1 second before my hand reached for the handle. It was as if the room were rehearsing its own life, playing back a preview of the next moment. Logbook 2, Day 10. The echo is becoming more frequent. It isn't an echo in the traditional sense. It doesn't linger. Instead, the room provides a ghostly rehearsal. I sat on my stool and heard the heavy thud of a book closing. A heartbeat later, I reached out and pulled the volume shut. Then came the sound of me exhaling, followed by the actual breath leaving my lungs. The house is anticipating me. Logbook 1, Day 14. The sky feels closer tonight. When I look up, the stars aren't tiny pinpricks. They feel like glowing rivets in a metal plate that is descending. I measured the distance from the roof to the highest clouds today. They are lower than they were on Monday. It is as if the universe is shrinking its container. Logbook 2, Day 18. The echo has changed its behavior. It no longer just mimics my actions. It begins to mimic the environment before it happens. Just now, I heard the floorboards groan under a heavy weight in the corner of the room. 1 second later, they groaned. But there was nothing on them. Then, I heard the sound of rain hitting the roof, a frantic, steady drumming. A moment later, the clouds broke and the rain actually began to fall. It is as if the room is a play being performed by a silent director who gives us a 1-second warning before every cue. Logbook 1, Day 21. The ceiling of the sky is now so low that I can see the texture of the vault. It looks like velvet stretched over stone. The lake has shrunk slightly as the pressure of the descending sky pushes it down. Everything feels compressed. I find myself holding my breath often, terrified that if I exhale too loudly, the sound will happen twice and confuse the timeline. Logbook 2, Day 25. Something is moving in the shadows of the cabin. It doesn't have a face or limbs in the way we do. It is a shimmering, gelatinous mass of iridescent scales, shaped like a heavy, pulsating lung. It moves with a wet, sliding motion. I call it the Weaver. It seems to be the one conducting the rehearsal. Logbook 1, Day 28. The Weaver has appeared fully in the center of the room. It is a mound of translucent amber skin, pulsing with internal light. It doesn't walk, it ripples. Every time it makes a sound, a low, melodic hum, it happens exactly 1 second before it produces its own vibration. It seems to be thinking the world into existence just before it manifests. Logbook 2, Day 32. The sky is heavy now. I can see the edges of the vault lid meeting the horizon. The distance between my head and the sky is barely 10 feet. The Weaver has grown larger, its amber skin stretching until it looks like a taut drum. It hums a deep note, and then, a second later, the very air vibrates with that same tone. I am starting to feel the pressure in my chest. Logbook 1, Day 35. Tonight, the sky touched the roof of the cabin. The stars are now large as lanterns, hovering just inches above our heads. The weaver is vibrating. So fast it has become a blur of gold and copper. It produces a sound like a shattering glass, asterisk crack, asterisk, and then the entire cabin floor cracked in perfect synchrony. Logbook 2, Day 38. The descent is almost complete. The sky is no longer above us, it is pressing against us. I can see the texture of the vault lid clearly now. It is not stone or velvet, but a vast, wrinkled hide. It is the skin of something massive. Logbook 1, Day 40. The weaver has stopped humming. It is perfectly still in the center of the room, its amber scales glowing with an intense, blinding heat. I can hear it preparing the final rehearsal. It produces one last sound, a long, low moan of anticipation that vibrates in my teeth. Logbook 2, Day 42. The sky finally touched the floor. There is no more space between the roof and the stars. The vault lid has closed completely, sealing us into a perfect cube of atmosphere. We are no longer in a cabin on a lake. We are inside the belly of the great thing. I can hear its heartbeat now, a slow, thumping pulse that echoes against the walls. The weaver is gone, absorbed into the skin of the ceiling. I am sitting in total darkness, waiting for the next sound to happen before it actually does. I heard the sound of something huge opening an eye above me, and I feel the lid begin to lift. The Guestbook at the edge of the void. My job as a regional delivery driver is usually a rhythmic cycle of beep beeps and rolling gates, but some packages feel heavier than others. I was tasked with delivering a single, leather-bound book to Lot 42, the final plot on the northern edge of a newly poured housing tract. It wasn't a house yet. It was just a vast expanse of wet, gray concrete foundation surrounded by the scent of damp earth and curing stone. The in-app notes for this specific drop-off were brief but strange. Place on the center slab. Do not let the Guestbook stay open for more than 3 minutes. I figured the homeowner was an eccentric architect or perhaps a poet who wanted to capture the silence of the raw foundation before the walls rose up to cage it in. As I stepped onto the concrete, the air felt thicker, pressing against my skin like a heavy velvet curtain. The ground was perfectly smooth, yet there were no footprints but mine. I set the book down, its cover embossed with gold filigree that caught the dying amber light of the afternoon sun. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the shadows began to stretch, lengthening across the concrete as if they were reaching for my ankles. It started with a sound, a wet, rhythmic thrumming, like a heartbeat muffled by deep water. I looked toward the far edge of the foundation and saw something move. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a ripple in the darkness, but then it solidified into a shape that defied my internal library of creatures. It stood, or rather, crouched at the opposite end of the slab. It had no face in the traditional sense. Instead, its head was a smooth, seamless orb of burnished copper, reflecting the surrounding trees like a distorted planet. But it was the legs that truly unsettled me. The entity didn't have feet. Instead, its body supported itself on 4 jointed knees that protruded from its torso like blooming lily pads. These knees didn't point forward. They all faced inward toward its center, creating a symmetrical crown of bone-colored ridges. It moved by shifting its weight and rotating those knees in a grinding motion, sliding across the concrete with a sound like grinding seashells. I froze. The entity paused, its copper head gleaming. I realized then that it wasn't just walking, it was observing the book. I felt a prickle of heat on my neck. The app chimed, a notification popped up. The Guestbook is reacting. My heart hammered against my ribs. I watched as the entity glided closer, its movements fluid and strange, its 4 knees rotating in perfect synchrony. It didn't have a mouth to speak with, yet a sound escaped it, a low, melodic hum that vibrated in my teeth. As it reached the book, it didn't just touch the page. One of its many jointed knees folded inward, pressing against the leather cover as if it were bowing. I held my breath, terrified to move and break the spell. The entity then did something unexpected. It leaned down and a small, needle-thin limb, not a finger, but a sharp, curved spike, reached out to touch the center of the page. In that instant, the ink on the page began to swirl like smoke. A name emerged from the white space, written in a script so elegant it looked like frozen lace. It wasn't my name, and it wasn't the owner's. It was a new entry, appearing as if a phantom hand had pressed down into the paper. The entity let out another hum, and the concrete beneath us seemed to shudder. I wanted to run, but my feet felt heavy, rooted to the slab by an invisible weight. I watched the name settle, the guest. Then, the entity's copper head spun 360 degrees, and for a split second, I saw my own reflection in its surface. But it wasn't just me. My reflection was waving at me with 3 hands, while my real hands remained gripped tight by fear. The air grew colder, the scent of wet earth intensifying until it felt as though the ground itself were exhaling. I took a step back, then another, reaching for the book to claim it before the entity could claim more. But as I reached out, the entity surged forward with a sudden, violent grace. It didn't just move, it unfolded. Its knees flared outward, spanning nearly the width of the foundation, and it pulled itself toward me like a collapsing flower. The copper orb of its head stopped inches from my chest. I could see tiny fractures in the metal, each one glowing with a faint, internal amber light. It was waiting for me to acknowledge the name it had signed. I realized then that the notes were right. The book couldn't stay open for too long. The ink began to bleed off the page, dripping onto the concrete like tears of midnight blue. I grabbed the book and pulled it toward my chest, feeling a jolt of electricity travel up my arm. The entity let out one final, mournful note, a sound like a cello string snapping underwater. It didn't vanish. It simply folded its knees inward until it became a compact, shimmering sphere of copper and bone. I gathered the book, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned and ran toward my truck, the sensation of being watched by that rotating head lingering on my skin like a physical touch. I tossed the book into the passenger seat and drove away without looking back at the foundation. I thought it was over once I reached the main road, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the book lying on the seat. The page was still open to the new entry. Beside the guest, a second name had appeared in that same elegant script, smaller and fainter than the first. It was my own name, followed by a single word that hadn't been there when I arrived. Next. The passenger of the shower block. The neon sign for the Wayfarer's Rest hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to pulse against my temples. It was 3 a.m, that hollow hour when the world feels abandoned by light and noise. My truck had sputtered to a halt at the far end of the lot, where the asphalt turned into gravel and the air tasted faintly of wet pine and old diesel. I needed to wash away the grit of a 12-hour haul. The shower block was a solitary building, a squat, brick structure with yellowed tiles and a heavy wooden door that groaned on its hinges. Inside, the steam hung in thick ribbons, smelling of lye soap and something metallic, like a penny held under a tongue. I stripped down and stepped into the stall, letting the scalding water pelt my shoulders until the tension began to melt. At first, there was only the steady drum of water against tile. But as I closed my eyes, a subtle sensation began to creep across my skin, a prickle at the base of my neck that didn't come from the heat. It felt like a phantom weight, as if something were standing just an inch behind my heel, watching the way my muscles relaxed. The water shifted from a roar to a hiss. I reached for the soap, but my hand hesitated in midair. That was when the sensation deepened into a heavy, localized pressure on my shoulder blade. It wasn't a physical touch yet, it was a gravitational pull, as if the air itself were beginning to sag under the weight of an invisible observer. Then came the sound, not a footfall, but a wet, sliding friction, like a piece of raw leather being dragged over velvet. I turned my head slightly. The steam seemed to thicken around the opposite wall of the stall, and for a heartbeat, I saw a silhouette. It wasn't a solid shape so much as a ripple in the heat. It moved with a jerky, stuttering grace, its limbs possessing an extra joint near the elbows that made it look perpetually poised to strike. It didn't have a body of its own. Instead, it was a vessel of hollow space held together by tension. As it drew closer, I realized it was wearing a face, not its own, but the face of a man who had clearly been dead for quite some time. The skin was stretched over the bone like cured leather, featuring deep, symmetrical grooves along the cheeks and a mouth that remained frozen in a soft, O-shaped pout. The most unsettling part was the way the mask sat. It didn't hug the skull perfectly. At the temples, there were tiny wrinkles where the skin gathered, as if the face were a slightly oversized glove pulled over a fist. I stood frozen as the entity drifted into my personal space. It wasn't walking so much as it was collapsing toward me, its heavy limbs folding in on themselves with every movement. I felt a strange, migrating warmth move from my chest into my ribs. It was a sensation of displacement, like a ghost limb being grafted onto my own skeleton. My left arm felt heavier, the bone feeling thicker and more porous than it had been seconds before. The entity raised its hand, a wide, paddle-like limb with 5 stubby digits, and pressed it against my chest. It didn't feel cold or hot. It felt like a memory of heat. As it touched me, I heard a faint, internal hum, the sound of 1,000 bees vibrating inside a jar. Then, the true transition began. My own pulse started to synchronize with its rhythmic hum. My ribs expanded not just because of my lungs, but because they were being pushed outward by something residing in the marrow. It was settling into me, weaving its invisible threads through my muscles. I could feel my own bones becoming less solid, more like wet clay, while its structure hardened within my frame. My fingers began to twitch independently, stretching toward the floor with that same extra joint at the elbow. The face mask moved closer, and for a moment, our gazes locked, or rather, my eyes met the strange, fixed expression of that leather skin. It wasn't just observing me, it was claiming the real estate of my anatomy. My shoulder felt like it was being occupied by a second set of blades. The heaviness in my chest became an ache of crowded space. It was as if I were a house, and this thing was the furniture moving into the rooms, rearranging the layout until there was barely enough room left for me to sit comfortably. I reached out with my right hand, the one that still felt entirely mine, and gripped its paddle-like palm. The connection was instantaneous. A rush of sensations flooded my brain, the taste of copper, the feeling of sinking into deep sand, and the sharp sting of a winter wind. It wasn't just haunting me, it was inhabiting me, folding its geography into my own until our boundaries blurred. I could feel its weight settling into my spine, making each vertebrae feel reinforced by a hidden strut. My breath hitched as the entity gave one final, shuddering heave, pulling itself completely into my ribcage. The phantom pressure on my shoulder vanished, replaced by a permanent, solid density. I stood there in the steam, no longer just a man taking a shower, but a composite being of flesh and borrowed architecture. When I finally stepped out and pulled the door shut, the silence of the truck stop felt different. I walked back toward my truck, my movements slightly more deliberate, my stride carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. I sat in the driver's seat and exhaled, feeling the extra joint in my elbow flex against the fabric of my shirt. I reached up to touch my own face, feeling the warmth of my skin, but then I noticed the subtle change in my jawline. It was slightly wider now, the bone shifting just a millimeter outward. The entity had finished moving in, leaving me with more room than before. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, but as the cabin lights dimmed, I felt it stir deep inside my chest, its leather face pressing against my heart from the inside out. The Library of the Unspoken. I found the book in the back corner of the university library, tucked between a dusty atlas and a crumbling manual on botany. It was a heavy, leather-bound volume with no title on its spine, but its margins were a chaotic battlefield of ink. Someone had used every spare inch of white space to scribble thoughts, questions, and frantic observations in a cramped, elegant cursive. As I sat in the corner of the reading room, tracing my finger along the notes, I realized that the handwriting wasn't just continuous. It felt conversational, as if the previous owner were whispering directly into my ear from across time. The most striking thing was how much space they had left for me to add my own marks, though most of the pages were already suffocated by their sprawling observations. I took the book home and began reading it while preparing for my overnight flight to London. I chose a red-eye because I wanted time to sink into the prose. By the 3rd hour of the flight, the cabin lights flickered once and then died, plunging us into a thick, velvet darkness. The hum of the engines became a low, rhythmic thrum that felt like a heartbeat. I leaned my head against the window, the book resting in my lap. It was then that I heard it, a faint, melodic echo from the very front of the plane. "Is anyone there?" I whispered to the empty space beside me, my voice barely carrying over the drone of the turbines. A moment later, a reply drifted back from the nose of the aircraft. "I am waiting for the rain." I froze. I hadn't said the words, "waiting for the rain." I had only asked if anyone was there. The echo didn't just repeat my sound. It answered with a new thought, as if something were listening and reacting. The cabin remained dim, lit only by the faint blue glow of the emergency strips. I turned a page, and the handwriting in the margin seemed to glow slightly. As I read, the echoes began to multiply. They weren't just coming from the front anymore. They were bouncing off the walls, weaving through the rows of sleeping passengers like invisible threads. "Why is the air so heavy?" I murmured. "Because the weight of the thoughts is pressing down," a voice replied from my left. I sat up straight, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice wasn't human. It had a textured quality, like velvet being dragged over gravel. It was coming from a point in the air just above my head. I looked around, but there were no faces to see, only the silhouettes of people slumped in their seats. Then, the door at the very front of the plane, the galley door that led to the cockpit, began to ripple. It didn't just open. It shimmered like a pond disturbed by a pebble. A silhouette emerged from the frame. It wasn't a person in the traditional sense. It was a creature composed of shifting, geometric textures. It had no face, instead possessing a surface that looked like hammered copper mixed with the iridescent sheen of a dragonfly's wing. Its body was a series of overlapping plates that moved independently, clinking softly like ceramic tiles. It didn't walk so much as it unfolded itself from the doorway, its shape shifting from a tall rectangle into a leaning, angular spire before settling into a hunched posture. The creature stepped into the cabin, moving with a strange, jerky grace. It didn't have limbs in the way we do. Instead, it had several tapering protrusions that swept outward like the rays of a sun. One of these rays reached out and touched my book. "What did you find?" it asked. Its voice was the same gravelly velvet as before. I gasped. "A world in the margins," I replied, my own voice trembling. The creature vibrated, a low hum that made the water in my cup ripple. It moved toward me, its copper plates shifting and clinking. It didn't have eyes to look at me with, but I felt its presence, a heavy, inquisitive pressure. It began to move through the passengers, who were all awake now, staring in stunned silence. The creature stopped before an old woman in 12B. It reached out a plate-like protrusion and touched her shoulder. "Are you tired of remembering?" it asked. The woman blinked, her eyes wide. "Yes," she whispered back. The creature turned back to me, its body expanding slightly as if it were inhaling the very atmosphere of the cabin. It seemed to be feeding on the silence we had shared with the book. "Tell me your secret," the creature commanded, hovering inches from my face. Its copper surface caught the faint blue light, casting dancing sparks against the ceiling. I thought of all the things I hadn't written in the margins, the fears I kept tucked away, the dreams that were too big to say out loud. "My secret is that I am afraid of the end," I said. The creature leaned in closer. Its plates shifted rapidly, creating a sound like 1,000 coins falling on silk. It seemed to ponder my words for a long beat. Then it did something unexpected. It reached into its own center, where a small, glowing aperture sat, and pulled out a single, perfectly formed word written in elegant cursive. "Begin." It placed the word in the air between us. As I watched, the word began to dissolve into tiny sparks of light that drifted toward the ceiling like embers from a fire. The creature then retreated, its plates folding inward until it was once again a simple, shimmering silhouette. With a final, resonant hum, it stepped back into the doorway at the front of the plane and merged with the frame, becoming indistinguishable from the wood and metal. The door sealed shut as if it had never been open. The cabin lights suddenly surged back to life, bathing everything in a warm, golden glow. The passengers exhaled in unison, the tension breaking like a wave. I looked down at my book, specifically at the last line of handwriting that hadn't been there before. It was fresh, the ink still wet, and then it spoke. I closed the book and looked toward the front of the plane, but when I glanced at the galley door, I realized the silhouette wasn't just an exit anymore. A faint, Copper-colored smear remained on the wood, as if something were still pressing its face against the other side. The terminal of unspoken birthdays. The silence of an airport terminal at 3 a.m. is not a true silence. It is a heavy, pressurized vacuum. When the last flight departs and the massive departure board finally flickers into darkness, the building seems to exhale. I was the only person left in Terminal C. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low-frequency buzz that vibrated in my molars, illuminating rows of empty metal chairs and the vast, polished expanse of the linoleum floor. Every suitcase stood like a stranded shipwreck, waiting for an owner who had already moved on. I sat on a bench near Gate 14, my own bag tucked between my feet, watching the way the overhead lights cast long, lonely shadows that stretched toward me like reaching arms. I pulled out my portable DVD player to kill the silence. It was an old, clunky model with a cracked screen, and I had spent most of the flight loading it with home movies from my childhood. I pressed play on a tape labeled Leo's 5th birthday. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy backyard bathed in the golden hue of a late afternoon sun. In the video, a small boy with messy hair sat at a table covered in blue streamers. He was laughing, his mouth wide open as he prepared to blow out the candles on a lopsided chocolate cake. But as I watched, something felt wrong. The colors were too vibrant, almost saturated beyond reality. And then there was the guests. In the video, 6 children were running around the grass, but they weren't interacting with each other. They moved in a synchronized circle, their feet hitting the ground at the exact same millisecond. It was as if they were choreographed by a conductor rather than playing freely. I blinked, and for a split second, the boy in the center of the frame, the birthday boy, didn't move at all. He sat perfectly still, his eyes wide and unblinking, while the other children blurred past him like streaks of wet paint. I paused the video. The silence of the terminal felt heavier now. I looked around the empty gate area, half expecting to see a ghost in the seats. Then I heard it, a wet, rhythmic clicking sound coming from beneath the rows of chairs. It sounded like joints being snapped and repositioned in rapid succession. I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. From behind the row directly in front of me, something emerged. It didn't walk. It flowed out like spilled mercury. It was a sprawling, crawling shape that seemed to possess too many elbows. Instead of the standard 4 limbs of a human, this entity had dozens of joints protruding from its torso, each one bending at sharp, accordion-like angles. Its body was covered in a texture resembling pebbled leather, and it lacked a face entirely, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, convex surface where features should be. However, that smooth surface pulsed with a faint, rhythmic amber light, as if a heart were beating just beneath the skin. It moved toward me on its many elbows, each joint clicking in a melodic sequence. It didn't have feet. It had multiple pointed protrusions that acted like anchors, allowing it to glide across the floor with an eerie, fluid grace. As it reached my bench, it stopped. The amber light on its faceless head pulsed faster. I felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature of the room had dropped 10 degrees. I remembered something then, a specific detail from a school attendance register my grandmother used to keep in her study. It was a dusty leather book where she recorded every student in the village. There was one name near the bottom of the 3rd page that stayed constant for years, the guest. Beside that name, no teacher had ever entered a grade, a comment, or a mark. It was just an empty space of potential. "Are you here?" I whispered, my voice sounding thin and alien in the vast hall. The entity didn't speak, but the amber light on its face rippled outward like a stone thrown into a pond. The clicking sound intensified, becoming a frantic, rapid-fire percussion. It began to wrap its many elbows around the back of my bench, pulling itself closer until its smooth head was inches from my shoulder. Then, the DVD player flickered again on its own. I hadn't touched the buttons. The image of the backyard birthday party returned, but it had changed. The boy in the center wasn't alone anymore. A tall, crawling shape with dozens of elbows was standing behind him, its many joints folded neatly like a closing fan. It reached out with one limb and touched the boy's shoulder. In the video, the boy didn't flinch. He simply smiled wider until his grin seemed to stretch past the point of being natural. I looked from the screen to the entity sitting beside me. The amber light on its head suddenly dimmed, and a new light appeared, a tiny, flickering spark in the very center of its smooth face. It was a reflection of the boy's smile from the video. The clicking stopped completely. The terminal became so still that I could hear my own breathing. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the entity's leathery skin. It felt warm, almost feverish. For a moment, it leaned its weight into my palm, the dozens of elbows shifting slightly to accommodate my touch. Then, with a sudden, sharp click, it pulled back and retreated into the shadows beneath the chairs. I sat there for a long time, the DVD player eventually running out of power and falling silent. The terminal felt different now, less empty, more inhabited. I stood up to leave, my legs feeling heavy as if I were walking through water. As I reached the main entrance, I turned back one last time to look at Gate 14. There, in the center of the floor, lay a single blue streamer from the video, perfectly preserved on the linoleum. It wasn't moving with the draft of the air conditioning. I stepped out into the night, the automatic doors hissing shut behind me. I could still hear that rhythmic clicking echoing in the back of my mind, even as the city noise swallowed the airport whole. I realized then that the entity hadn't just been watching the birthday party, it had been waiting for a guest to join it. As I walked toward my car, I felt a slight weight on my shoulder, and though no one was there, I could see the faint, amber glow of a smile lingering in the air just behind my ear. The Canyon of the Silent Chord. 2:14 a.m. The renovation team cleared out last night. Now, the children's ward is a skeletal ribcage of white plaster and vacant beds. I am the only soul left in this wing, tasked with ensuring the floor wax has dried before the morning shift arrives. 2:16 a.m. It is unnervingly quiet. Usually, a hospital hums with the pulse of machinery, but here, it is just the absence of sound. I walk down aisle 4, my footsteps sounding heavier than they should. 2:19 a.m. There is a canyon in the center of the ward, a wide gap between two rows of beds where the floor seems to drop away into a subterranean hollow. It has no far wall. It feels like an infinite trench carved into the tile. 2:21 a.m. I shout, "Hello," into the trench. The sound travels down, deep and hollow. 2:23 a.m. Something is wrong with the echo. It doesn't return immediately. There is a 3-second delay of pure, pressurized silence before the word "hello" bounces back up. 2:25 a.m. I shout again. This time, the echo returns as "hello." The first syllable has been clipped, as if something caught it halfway down and chewed on it. 2:30 a.m. A strange sensation prickles my neck. It feels like a heavy weight is pressing against the air from the bottom of the canyon. I look down into the dark. 2:45 a.m. Camera 1 records. 4 p.m. I am standing perfectly still at the edge of the trench, my shadow stretched long across the floor. 2:46 a.m. Wait. The timestamp on camera 2 says it is 4 p.m. My watch says it is 2:46 a.m. The discrepancy makes the air feel thick, like honey. 3:01 a.m. I hear a vibration in my chest. It isn't a sound yet. It's a physical pulse. From the canyon, a single, unbroken tone begins to rise. It is a low, steady note that feels less like music and more like a constant, vibrating hum of a giant cello string held indefinitely. 3:05 a.m. I lean over the edge. The light from the overhead fluorescence dies out for a moment, then flickers back on. 3:07 a.m. A figure is rising from the trench. It does not walk. It unfolds like a ribbon of silk being pulled from a box. It is a body sliced into perfectly horizontal color bar stripes, emerald green, burnt orange, deep violet, and ochre yellow. Each stripe is sharp, as if the entity were stacked slices of fruit. 3:10 a.m. The entity has no mouth to move, yet that unbroken tone continues to vibrate from its torso. It does not breathe. Instead, it holds that one long note where a human breath should be, a constant drone that resonates in my teeth. 3:12 a.m. Its face is strange. It has no nose and no ears. Its eyes are wide, circular discs of copper. It moves toward the edge with a rhythmic swaying motion, its striped body shimmering as it catches the light. 3:15 a.m. I reach out a hand. The entity stops just inches from my fingertips. The tone shifts slightly, it doesn't change pitch, but it gains volume, vibrating so hard that the dust on the floor begins to dance in patterns. 4 p.m., Camera 1 Records. I am reaching out toward the entity. 2:48 a.m., my hand trembles. The striped figure leans forward, its copper discs of eyes fixing on mine. It doesn't have a mouth to smile with, yet it seems to be grinning in its own way. 3:20 a.m., who are you? I whisper. 3:21 a.m., the entity responds by shifting the tone. For 1 second, the drone breaks into a sharp, crystalline crack, the sound of a dry branch snapping in deep water. 3:25 a.m., it begins to climb out of the canyon. As it rises, its stripes begin to rotate like the wheels of a carousel. The colors blur into a spinning kaleidoscope. It moves with a heavy, liquid grace, leaving a trail of iridescent slime on the floor tiles. 3:30 a.m., it stands fully upright before me. It is taller than I expected, its body stretching out like a long, segmented accordion. The unbroken tone is now so loud that it feels like a physical weight pushing against my ribcage. 3:45 a.m., Camera 2 Records. The time reads 12 p.m. Everything in the ward is frozen except for me and the entity. For a.m., I realize the canyon isn't just a hole in the floor, it's a throat. The entity is the tongue of something much larger, hidden beneath the tiles. For 15 a.m., the striped figure reaches out with a limb that looks like a piece of braided velvet. It touches my shoulder. The copper discs of its eyes widen until they are almost the size of saucers. For 20 a.m., the tone suddenly stops. The silence that follows is so absolute it feels heavy, like being plunged underwater. For 30 a.m., the entity begins to pull me inward. Not by grabbing my hand, but by pulling the air toward itself. I feel myself sliding toward the canyon, toward the endless trench with no far wall. 5 a.m., Camera 1 Records. The time is now 11:59 p.m. 5:01 a.m., I am falling into the hollow. As my head passes the edge, I see the rest of the entity. It isn't just a body. It is part of a massive, rotating spine that stretches deep into the earth. 5:05 a.m. The stripes of its body begin to change color rapidly, flashing through every hue of the spectrum in a frantic pulse. 5:10 a.m., I land softly on a surface that feels like damp suede at the bottom of the canyon. 5:15 a.m., the entity looms over me, its copper eyes glowing with an internal light. It opens its chest, a flat plane of smooth marble, and releases the first breath it has held for centuries. 5:20 a.m., the sound isn't a note anymore. It is my own name, spoken by a voice that sounds like grinding stones. 5:30 a.m., I look up and see the far wall finally appear. It isn't made of stone or wood. It is a giant, lidless eye looking back at me from the depths. 6 a.m., the light fades as the entity closes its marble chest. 6:15 a.m., Camera 2 Records. The time reads 1 a.m. 6:30 a.m., I am lying on my back, staring at the ceiling of the canyon, which is slowly beginning to contract like a closing fist. 7 a.m., just as the floor begins to hum again, the entity leans down and whispers its final secret into my ear with that one long, unbroken tone. 7:15 a.m., I realize now why there was no far wall at first. It was simply waiting for me to arrive so it could decide where the end begins. The second frame. I am the host, and I have stopped moving. My pulse is a steady hum in the marrow of my bones, but my limbs are frozen in the pose of exhaustion against the cold metal tray. I am currently observing my own life through the eyes of everyone watching, though for the last 10 minutes, my body has been as still as a statue. The morgue's freezer unit hums with a low, vibrating groan that feels like it is trying to swallow the silence of the room. It is 3 a.m. and I am performing the annual audit of the unclaimed drawer, the row of bodies that have no names yet, only numbers on their toes. The air here smells of ozone and damp linen. To my left, a single flickering fluorescent bulb casts a jittery light over the rows of steel shelves. It is usually quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat, but tonight, the silence feels heavy, like a thick velvet curtain pressing against my eardrums. I reached for the silver tray on the third shelf, and that was when I saw it, a small, rectangular piece of plastic sticking out from between two bodies. It was a home videotape, labeled in shaky handwriting with the word "me." My breath hitched. Who would leave a personal tape in this industrial tomb? I pulled it out, my fingers numb from the frost. As I held it, a sensation prickled at the base of my neck, the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't there. I sat down on a small wooden stool and pressed play on the portable projector I'd brought along. The screen flickered to life against the tiled wall. It was a grainy, domestic scene, a kitchen table with a half-eaten piece of toast. And there, sitting in the chair, was a person. It had my face. Not just my features, but every mole, every curve of my lip, and my specific shade of messy hair. But the body it sat on was different. It was broader, with shoulders that stretched the fabric of its sweater. It looked like me from the chest down, yet it moved with a strange, rhythmic twitch. In the video, I reached out and grabbed a glass of water, but my hand didn't move toward the glass. It drifted toward something just off camera. A shadow flickered in the corner of the frame, a shape that was darker than the surrounding room. It didn't have many features. It looked like a silhouette made of wet velvet, with a head that was slightly elongated and a torso that seemed to ripple like water. It wasn't my shadow, but it was following me in the video. I realized then that while I was eating toast, the shadow was reaching out, its texture shifting from smooth to pebbled as it moved toward my face. The audio on the tape was just a low, constant clicking sound, like a typewriter working underwater. As I watched, the me in the video stopped moving entirely. It stayed perfectly still for 3 seconds before turning its head to look directly at the camera. In that moment, the shadow behind it surged forward. It didn't have many limbs. It had 4 thick, overlapping segments of movement that looked like a cross between a wing and a heavy fabric fold. It reached out and touched my shoulder in the video. I felt a sudden, sharp chill on my actual shoulder in the real morgue. The temperature plummeted. A small puff of frost escaped my lips. I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that the shadow wasn't just in the video anymore. It was in the room with me. It lived in the space between now and next. Every time I blinked, it moved 1 step closer to where I would be a second later. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. The shadow appeared on the wall opposite me. It didn't have eyes, but it had a texture of deep, rippling folds that looked like crushed silk. It was moving toward my face, but not in a straight line. It moved in a series of sudden, jerky leaps. It reached the spot where my head would be and paused. Then I saw its face, a cluster of tiny, pulsating ridges that mimicked the shape of my own nose and mouth. It was my twin, made of velvet and motion. I felt its presence press against my cheek. It wasn't a ghost. It was a second version of my existence, a shadow that arrived at every destination just before I did. It reached out with one of its heavy, fabric-like segments and touched the center of my forehead. The cold was absolute. It didn't feel like ice. It felt like the absence of heat. I realized that while I had been watching the video of me, the shadow had been traveling through the tape to find me in the present. It moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, its body expanding and contracting as if it were breathing. It didn't make a sound until it finally reached my chest. Then it did something unexpected. It folded inward, collapsing like an accordion until it was only the size of a small stone. I held my breath, afraid that even a sigh would break the spell. The shadow me stayed there for a heartbeat, then began to vibrate. The vibration traveled up my arm and into my ribs. Then the silence broke. It didn't speak in words. It spoke in a resonance that felt like a hum inside my teeth. Finally, it seemed to pulse. I realized then that it wasn't just waiting for me to arrive at the spot. It had been waiting for me to inhabit its shadow. The shadow began to stretch out again, but this time, it didn't stop at my skin. It merged with me. My skin felt as though it were being dipped into a pool of cool silk. I looked down at my hands and saw the dark, velvet texture creeping over my knuckles, turning my flesh into something soft and rippled. The shadow was no longer following me. It was becoming my coat, my skin, my very surface. I reached out to touch the wall, and my hand left a smudge of deep, rich velvet behind. The room felt larger, the walls further away, as if the shadow were stretching the space around us. I stood up again, and this time, I didn't feel heavy. I felt layered. Every movement I made was echoed by the ripple of the fabric skin beneath my own. The entity had finally caught up to me in the sequence of time. It had finished its journey through the video and across the room to claim its host. I looked back at the projector, which was still running. On the screen, me was now standing up, moving toward the camera with a face made of velvet folds. The shadow me on my own body stood tall, its rippled texture catching the light of the flickering bulb. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was my new reality. I realized that I was no longer the only version of myself in this room. As the projector flickered out and the last bit of light died, I felt something press against the back of my neck, not from the front, but from the inside out. It wasn't just a shadow following me. It was the shadow waiting for me to become it. The frame of my own ghost. Inheriting the Blackwood farm felt less like a gift and more like a sentence. It was a sprawling, lonesome stretch of land where the grass grew in waves like an ocean of dried wheat, and the wind seemed to carry a constant, low-frequency hum, a sound that lived in the marrow of my bones rather than just in my ears. The farmhouse stood alone at the center of this desolate expanse, a skeletal structure of timber and stone that had survived decades of isolation. It possessed a weary dignity, its windows like sunken eyes watching the horizon. I moved in during an early autumn, seeking the profound silence of the countryside to finish my thesis, but from the moment I crossed the threshold, the house felt occupied by a heavy, patient presence. It wasn't just empty space, it was a vessel holding something that didn't quite know if it wanted to be seen. On the first night, while unpacking crates in the attic, a dusty labyrinth of memories and cobwebs, I found a heavy, brass-cased home video camera sitting atop a pile of moth-eaten blankets. Beside it lay a single reel labeled "The Guest" in shaky, elegant handwriting. I spent my second afternoon watching the footage, the hum of the house outside syncing with the mechanical whirring of the machine. It began with a wide shot of the living room, the same room where I was currently sitting, the floorboards creaking under my weight. In the center of the frame stood a figure. It wasn't human, not exactly. It was tall, reaching toward the rafters like a stretching spire, covered in what looked like overlapping scales of iridescent copper. Each scale caught the light with a metallic sheen that shifted from deep amber to pale gold. Instead of hair, a crown of stiff, translucent bristles sprouted from its scalp, vibrating slightly as if reacting to an invisible current. Its arms were peculiar. They didn't just hang at its sides like human limbs. They swayed with a rhythmic, liquid grace, ending in hands that possessed 4 thick digits, each tipped with a blunt, rounded knob rather than a sharp nail. Most unsettling was its face. It had no nose or ears, only 2 wide, horizontal slits for eyes and a mouth that looked like a stitched seam. As I watched the screen, my heart hammered against my ribs. In the video, the copper-scaled entity moved with a slow, deliberate gait, as if it were walking through honey. But something was wrong with its proportions. Every time the camera paused or the figure shifted slightly out of focus, its arms seemed to stretch. It was as if it were growing while I wasn't looking at it, expanding in the briefest of intervals. When the camera zoomed in on its face for 3 seconds, its arms were roughly waist-length. When the shot cut away to a wide angle of the fireplace, the arms grew to reach past its knees. By the final frame of the reel, the copper entity was nearly sprawling across the floor, its limbs extending toward the edges of the screen like reaching vines in a time-lapse. Then I noticed the most haunting detail. In the middle of the footage, for just a heartbeat, the creature turned toward the lens and blinked. For that 1 second, its face wasn't a copper-scaled mess. It was my face. Not a likeness, but my exact face, the slight mole on my chin, the specific curve of my eyebrows, the way my hair fell over my left eye. It was as if someone had stolen my identity and draped it over that towering alien body. I put the camera down, but the hum in the house changed pitch, dropping into a low, vibrating thrum. I felt a sudden, sharp awareness of the attic's corners. The copper entity wasn't just on the film, it was in the house now. I tried to convince myself it was just a lingering memory of the previous owner, but the way the air grew heavy suggested otherwise. Every time I blinked, every time I turned my head to check the door or adjust a chair, I felt the sensation of movement behind me. It was a constant game of hide-and-seek. When I looked at it, it froze, holding its copper scales perfectly still. The moment I diverted my gaze to reach for a book or take a sip of water, it surged forward with a ghost-like fluidity. I began to notice the physical evidence of its growth. On the third day, I found a smudge of iridescent copper dust on the doorframe, as if something had brushed against it while I slept. On the fourth, there were faint indentations in the carpet where its heavy, knobbed fingers had pressed down. It was expanding, claiming more territory with every second of my distraction. By the end of the week, the farmhouse felt crowded. I could never stay still for long. If I sat to eat, I would see it standing by the kitchen table, its arms barely touching the floor. But if I reached for my fork, its arms would lunge outward, lengthening until they brushed against the walls with a soft, metallic hiss. It was a creature of the periphery, a tenant that lived in the gaps of my attention. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the farmhouse in shades of bruised purple and charcoal gray, I decided to confront it. The shadows were long and stretched like fingers across the floorboards. I sat in the center of the living room and closed my eyes for exactly 10 seconds, trying to steady my breathing. When I opened them, the copper entity was standing 3 feet away, its arms now reaching all the way to the floorboards at my feet. I held my breath and blinked again, a quick, involuntary twitch of the eyelids. In that fraction of a second, it moved closer. It was now only 2 feet away. Its face, my face, was staring directly into mine, the copper scales shimmering in the dying light. I realized then that it wasn't just growing, it was reaching for me. It wanted to occupy the same space I did. It wanted to wear me like a suit of clothes. I took a deep breath and stared at its face, refusing to let my eyes wander even a millimeter. For a full minute, I watched those horizontal slits of its eyes. The copper scales stopped shimmering. Its arms stayed perfectly still, frozen in midair like the legs of a giant spider. It was waiting for me to fail, waiting for that inevitable moment when my focus would waver and it could lunge. I finally stood up, my chair scraping against the floor with a sharp protest, and walked toward the bedroom to sleep. I kept my eyes fixed on the creature until my foot hit the threshold of the doorway. It stayed perfectly still, a copper statue with my own features. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the mattress sink beside me. The copper entity was there, looming over my pillow like a silent guardian or a patient predator. I didn't open my eyes immediately, fearing what would happen if I did. But eventually, exhaustion won. I let my eyelids flutter shut. When I opened them again, the house was silent. The creature was no longer standing beside me. It was hovering directly above my face, its copper scales nearly touching my skin. Its arms had grown so long that they wrapped around my entire body like a cocoon of metallic silk. And there, reflected in the tiny glint of its horizontal eyes, I saw my own face, and just beneath it, a second set of teeth began to emerge from my chin. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.